we have to honor women as nation builders in Canada. We started most of the libraries, most of the schools. Women started most of the hospitals. I encountered a friend who I hadn't seen for a number of years who was finishing research on a book about gravestones and the history that's taught through them. And so I said to her, how many of the gravestones are women? She said, well, quite a few, but they only talk about them being mothers or wives of, or daughters of. It doesn't talk about their achievements. And it was the same thing for a group called the Famous Five.
Much has been written in journals, papers, and books by a significant group of academics and authors about feminism and the equality movement. And there's a growing inventory of productions about women in Canadian life. We want to add more. The Women's History Project is a nonprofit organization launched in 2022. Our ambition is to promote and showcase women in Canadian history. We want trailblazers, leaders, authors, and historians to tell stories about women in the labor movement, at work, in the media, women who took to the streets, equal pay, maternity benefit, the right to have your own bank account. We want to get women who are still living to recount their challenges and campaign. History is rich with stories about advocates, activists, and women in public life at the community, provincial, and national levels, across Canada, in small towns, on farms, in urban areas, women who have used their voice to make a difference. This is 1,000 Voices, 1,000 Stories. Frances Wright, feminist, entrepreneur, social justice advocate. Born in South Africa, Frances's family immigrated to Canada and settled in Calgary when she was 6 years old. Frances has had a varied career as a stockbroker, publisher, journalist, communications consultant, and entrepreneur. In 1996, Frances co-founded the Famous Five Foundation, an organization that profiles 5 women who, in 1929, appealed a Supreme Court of Canada decision to the UK Privy Council to recognize women as persons and therefore eligible to be appointed to the Senate of Canada. In tribute to the 70th anniversary of the Persons case, the Famous Five Foundation installed larger-than-life bronze monuments, one in Calgary in 1999 and one on Parliament Hill in 2000. Together, the monuments are the largest art installation in Canada. Recognizing women as nation builders, Frances also campaigned for women to be on Canadian currency and postage stamps, and campaigned for gender-neutral language in O Canada. In 2012, Frances co-founded the Canadian Centre for Adult Male Survivors of Childhood Sexual Abuse and ran the centre for over 7 years. Frances has served on over 24 boards, including the Canadian Foundation for AIDS Research, Equal Voice Alberta South, and International Women's Forum Calgary. She received the Order of Canada in 2024.
I'm Deborah Davis. I'm president and co-founder of the Women's History Project. Today, I'm talking to Frances Wright, a longtime friend, but also an entrepreneur, a social activist, a campaigner, and the chief executive officer of Famous Five Foundation. I first met Frances in 1997 when Frances came to Ottawa looking for help to have a statue of the Famous Five to be put on Parliament Hill. And she has a fascinating story to tell, so we're going to talk to Frances now. Thank you for joining me. Okay, Frances, we're going to start at the beginning. Tell us a little bit about your background, and in particular, how your background influenced you and drove you to the kind of work that you've done throughout your career in the Famous Five Foundation.
Well, I'm a lucky person who is the daughter of people who are very involved in the community, be it through home and school, the establishment of rugby clubs throughout Alberta, in terms of my father, but both in terms of politics too. And being an immigrant, I'm very much aware of the benefits of being a Canadian citizen. And I hear negative comments about immigrants, and I want to make it perfectly clear that immigrants significantly contribute to the good things in Canada primarily. And one of the ways to do it is to champion various issues.
I want to congratulate you, Frances, for receiving the Order of Canada a couple of days ago. It's a high honor and much deserved. And I know you've won many awards for your work, your community work, but certainly tell me a little bit about that Order of Canada.
Well, I accepted it on behalf of everybody who helped us with the project. But I had the pleasure of being the CEO of the Famous Five Foundation for 10 years, but the highlight really was the 70th anniversary in Calgary of the person's case, and then the 71st anniversary here in Ottawa. And that's when I called upon you, Deborah, for help. But you were off on a very exciting new position in London, England. And so you recommended some other people to get involved. So part of the leaf of the Order of Canada is yours.
Thank you very much. But you did all the work. You and your team. No. You and your team did all the work. So what drew you to the Famous Five? I mean, if you were a young woman, Calgary, what drew you to Famous Five?
Calgary's a very masculine city because we're not a capital city and we're not an academic city, shall we say. We do have wonderful universities there, but the major industry, of course, is energy, and energy is very much dominated by men who believe in many respects that women are secondary citizens. And just growing up, I didn't want to be a secondary citizen. So I think I've been a feminist all my life. And then in 1974, I was a stockbroker and talking about government policies because I was a liberal and I would explain things. And one day before an election, 60 men came to the office and I guess harassed me because they were very upset about the federal government saying that they had to pay taxes to the federal government before they calculated and took off what the royalties were to provinces. And they were sure that the first Mr. Trudeau was trying to kill the energy industry and them. And so I went home that night. I had bruises on my back and bruises on my arm because they grabbed me and they swore at me. And so I decided, if I have to take this sort of treatment, why don't I be a Liberal candidate? And so through my mother's connections and father's connections, I approached the campaign manager, who initially was keen. They didn't have anybody else to run in Calgary Centre. But he said to me at the end of the conversation, no, I'm not prepared to sign your papers because you are young. I was 24. You're female and you're a feminist. But I had worked in Ottawa when I was doing my journalism degree. And one of the jobs I had was working on Parliament Hill. So I got to know different people. And one of the people I got to know was Pierre Trudeau's executive assistant, Mary MacDonald.
Yes.
And so I phoned her and said, what do you think about me running in Calgary Centre? Do you know anybody else that's running in Calgary Centre? Does the party have plans for Calgary Centre? And she said, no, just think about it. So I went back to Earl Hastings, senator, and said, I think I would still like to be the candidate in Calgary Centre. And he said, well, I'm still not prepared to sign your papers. Have you got a candidate? I asked him. No, he said. So then I phoned Mary back and said, he won't sign my papers, therefore I can't run. And she said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll go to 102 Bank Street, the Liberal headquarters, pick up the papers, and I'll have Mr. Trudeau sign them. And so he did. And so I campaigned. I did the best of all the Liberals in Calgary, second best in the province. And then for some reason or other, I decided I would run again. I was freelancing as a journalist at the time. And that I would run again in 79. And I did, and did, again, the best in Calgary Centre, but not enough to win. But I wanted the idea of women persevering, women doing it not to get appointments from the federal government, because Mr. Trudeau had offered me several appointments and I turned them down. I said, no, I'm running for the principles of it. Yeah. So having done that, you meet people and you get exposed to all kinds of fabulous ideas. And when it was 1997, and we were coming to the end of a decade, a century, and a millennium. And we looked at the kind of projects that were being proposed to remember Canada and Canadians, and none of them had to do with women. And luckily, I encountered a friend who I hadn't seen for a number of years, who was finishing research on a book about gravestones and the history that's taught through them. And so I said to her, how many of the gravestones are women? She said, well, quite a few, but they only talk about them being mothers or wives of, or daughters of. It doesn't talk about their achievements. And it was the same thing for a group called the Famous Five. Now, I knew about the Famous Five because in the 1980s, I was part of a campaign to have Nellie McClunk's Calgary house. She lived on the corner of 15th Avenue and 8th Street, declared a provincial historic site. But I really didn't know about all the others.
Yeah.
But Nancy Miller, who was my friend, was a historian, and she'd written a book about the Famous Five, so she gave it to me. And that solidified the determination that, yes, we have to honor women as nation builders in Canada. We've started most of the libraries, most of the schools. Women started most of the hospitals. And so it was very clear to Nancy and I that we had to form an organization and start developing some sort of project for the year 2000. But Nancy knew that on October 18, 1999, it would be the 70th anniversary of the Persons case. Now, the reason the Persons case was established was to allow women to serve in the Senate. But the overarching triumph of the Persons case was the declaration of the principle of equality.
So talk a little bit about, just for the people that are listening, the Famous Five. Up until then, women were not allowed being appointed to the Senate. It went to the Supreme Court of Canada.
That's right.
They were not allowed because they were not defined as persons in the BNA Act.
Because some pesky women in 1873 in England had voted, were elected, sent to jail, tried, and the judge said, women are eligible for pains and penalties, but not rights and privileges. So that was the legal precedent that the Supreme Court of Canada considered in 1927. And they also said all the nouns, pronouns, and adjectives in the BNA Act of 1867, our Constitution, were he, his, and him. So it was very clear who was to govern and who was to be governed.
So talk a little bit about, just again, for the listeners, there were 5 women from different parts of Western Canada.
Yeah, primarily, well, Alberta. The thing is, at that time in the Supreme Court of Canada Act was a clause saying that any 5 citizens acting as a unit could ask for clarification from the Supreme Court of a word, a phrase, or a clause. So Emily Murphy, who was the first female justice in the British Empire, not a lawyer, but a person who was very interested in laws as they pertain to women and children and the conditions of women's lives, she said, we must do something. Because they had written to, I think, 5 prime ministers who had all said, our hands are tied. We can't appoint a woman. So she got together on August 27th, 1927, a group of women. She invited Henrietta Muir Edwards, who at that time was already 80 years old and living in southern Alberta, was even south of Calgary, who had established the Victorian Order of Nurses, who had established the National Council of Women, who had established the prototype of the YWCA. And we sort of say, Henrietta could have said, find a young whippersnapper. I think I've already done significant contributions to Canada. But she got on the train, 5 hours up to Edmonton. And waiting for her in Edmonton was Irene Parlby, who grew up in England. She's the only sort of non-Canadian initially. Grew up in England and whose father was invited to come to central Alberta because some friends of his from the military had settled there. And he couldn't go. He was a Tory MP in Britain. He couldn't go, but Irene, who was still unmarried at age 25, which was very unusual in a wealthy family, she said, no, I want to marry who I love and I want to have a meaningful life. So she comes out instead for 3 months, and just before she's due to return, Walter Parlby comes by, and he's actually a Greek scholar from Oxford who had come with his brother 2 years earlier and settled in central Alberta. And we say their eyes met, their hearts pounded, and Irene became a Canadian. But she was already, by then, getting involved with the United Farmers of Alberta and goes on to be the president of the United Farmers. And although Alberta was the 3rd province to give women the right to vote, we were the first province to hold an election. And in that election, now I'm switching to Louise. Louise McKinney was involved with the Women's Christian Temperance Union. She organized over 20 chapters across Alberta and Saskatchewan. I mean, how did she do this, Deborah? No phones, no faxes, no computers, no cars, but word of mouth, and the women get together. And so both the Liberals and the Conservatives come to Louise, who lives in Claresholm, and ask her to be their candidate. And Louise asks them one question. Does your party take contributions from liquor companies? And of course, both the Liberals and the Conservatives said, oh, sure. And in fact, we hand out liquor on election day so that you come and vote or because you voted for us. So she decides, I'm not running for either of you. And as an independent, a truly staggering success story, she gets elected. She's the first woman in Canada, first woman in the British Empire to be elected by both men and women. And she serves one term. And in the interim, she meets Irene Parlby, who's in Lacombe. And in the next election, Louise is defeated, but Irene is elected. She really didn't want to be a candidate, but she stood for election and got elected. And her party, the United Farmers, became the government of Alberta. And when they looked around the cabinet table, they said, well, who's going to be a cabinet minister and accept responsibilities? Irene was probably one of the best educated, and she knew politics. But they would not appoint her as a full cabinet minister on the basis of one, well, you know how women like to talk. And there's state secrets in cabinet, and so we can't have a woman because she's going to blab. Secondly, politics is a tough game. And if a woman is a cabinet minister, she's going to be challenged, and in public, she's going to cry. We can't have that. And the third reason was, well, you know, for about a week every month, women are insane. They can't think straight. They lose their tempers. So there is no way we can have a female cabinet minister. But what Irene goes on to do with the title Minister Without Portfolio, she goes and talks to the Minister of Education and says, can't we send books and professors out to the countryside and to other parts? Why not create distance education? Oh, says the Minister of Education, what a great idea. He introduces the bill, it's passed, and all of a sudden Albertans are being educated, living in different parts of the province. Then Irene looks around and says, we don't have any doctors living in lots of parts of the province. Can we not send out traveling medical clinics? Oh, says the Minister of Health, I like that idea. He proposes it, it gets passed, he gets the credit. So she's known as the Minister of Cooperation and goes on to be a delegate to the United Nations. And then the last person to come to the Tea Party on Emily's porch in 1927 was Nellie McClung. Now, Louise had been elected in the very first election in 1917, but when she runs in 1921, she's defeated because Albertans decide they want to drink anytime, anywhere, whatever. But two women are elected. One is Irene Parlby, and the other one's Nellie McClung. Nellie is elected as a Liberal member from Edmonton, and she is well known because, of course, she and her friends got the breakthrough for women to be able to vote and run for office. It's a dual victory. And people thought she's going to be the first woman elected in Manitoba, but for some reason, before Manitoba had a provincial election, her husband said, let's go to Edmonton. So she moves to Edmonton, and luckily she's persuaded by the Liberals to run, and she becomes the MLA for Edmonton in 1921. But then her husband moves to Calgary. And Calgarians weren't as smart, weren't as smart as Edmontonians, and they didn't vote for her. But by then, she was asked to speak in different parts of the United States about suffrage. She was serving on the board of directors, the first woman to serve on a major board in Canada, and that was the board of directors of CBC. So 5 extraordinary women came together. They didn't really know each other, but they came together to increase democracy in Canada by enabling women to be senators. And so when, in April of 28, the Supreme Court of Canada said, no, women are not persons, they were extremely disappointed. But you have to take a minute to process the sorrow and the disappointment, and then you keep going. You keep your eye on the prize. And they said, there's this little clause in the Supreme Court, so let's ask the federal government if they will pay for the expenses to go to the Privy Council, which was a subcommittee of the British Cabinet, if they will hear the case, because it really was the Supreme Court of Canada. We may have had it in name, but in action, our Supreme Court then was not supreme. And luckily, the Prime Minister, William Lyon Mackenzie King, agreed to this. And on October 18th, 1929, the judges of the Privy Council of Great Britain said, yes, of course, women are persons. And when somebody says, why should the word person include women? The answer is, why not? And not to do so means you'll have a remnant of days more barbarous than ours. They recognized the achievements, the contributions that these women and other women had already made in Canada. And although Britain didn't have quite the same suffrage for their women as we had in Canada, thanks to these 5 and others, they saw the potential by involving both men and women.
And it was not just persons for Canada, it was for the Commonwealth.
Because they were the Supreme, that's a good point. They were the Supreme Court for all the Commonwealth countries, or the British Empire, they said in those days.
Excellent.
Imagine 5 women got together and the change that they made. And everybody expected, and Emily really wanted to be Canada's first female senator. But the first opening, because Senate appointments are based on geographic area as well, came in Ontario. And it was a remarkable woman by the name of Karine Wilson. And she's known as the mother of refugees, who became the first female senator. But a couple of years later, an opening happens in Alberta. And everybody thinks, it's Emily. Emily's going to become the second female senator. But the Prime Minister says, we have to take into concern religious affiliations of our senators. And the 5 senators from Alberta that remain are Protestant, and the one who died was a Catholic. So I really must appoint a Catholic senator. Are you, Mrs. Murphy, a Catholic, knowing full well Mrs. Murphy's husband was an Anglican minister, and she'd been an Anglican minister's wife for 30 years. So instead, he appoints a man who is a Catholic, but who is a liberal. So he could overlook the political affiliation, but he did not want this pushy woman.
Can't have 2 senators. Can't have 2 women senators.
That's right.
That's a fabulous story.
And she dies. She dies maybe a year later. We say of a broken heart, but she had advanced diabetes. So it's sad.
Fabulous women. Fabulous women. And to this day, you still honor them and keep their memory alive through your pink teas, by honoring contemporary women who are...
Yes. The pink teas, the reason we do the pink teas is because when women were working to get the right to vote and the right to run for elected office, their meetings were often violently disrupted. The opponents would come in and knock over the furniture and yell and scream and pull the women that they knew out of the room. And other women who were sympathetic to suffrage were afraid to come to the meetings. So somehow or other, the women say, well, why don't we just call our meetings teas? And we'll maybe just talk about kids and dogs and whatever, if there are opponents there. But the opponents didn't come to teas. And in Quebec and the Maritimes, the women even added sherry to their teas. And that's how they became known as pink teas. And no opponent, Deborah, ever came to break up a pink tea, nor brag about. I guess there were no bragging rights, right?
Right.
You couldn't brag. I broke up a pink tea, Fred, Sam, and Bob and I. And so they were successful in gaining suffrage.
So let's just come up to a little bit more contemporary times. In 1997, you came to me when I was working in the Prime Minister's office, and you said, Deborah, I'd like to put a statue on Parliament Hill. There's only one woman on Parliament Hill, and that was a statue of the Queen. And there were no statues of women. And you had this brilliant idea. And I was leaving the country. to take up a position in London. And so I got together with some friends. But tell us about the campaign to get that statue on Parliament Hill and the statue itself, which is formidable. I mean, it's an extraordinary statue.
Thank you. It was my mother-in-law, who was also working in the PMO, Diana Putmans, who suggested I contact you. She was very impressed with you, Deborah. And when you couldn't, you introduced me to a woman by the name of Isabel Metcalf, who I very quickly decided this would be an excellent person to work with to get the statues on Parliament Hill. And so with my journalism background, I contacted some friends who were working for the Ottawa Journal, I think it was at the time, and just put in a little notice saying, we're going to have a meeting in the press club, National Press Club. Yep. And if anybody would like to come, please do. And about 50, 60 women showed up that night. And I feel badly now in terms of what my presentation was, because we didn't really have the statue. We didn't have the monument. We didn't know there were 3 guidelines for putting statues on Parliament Hill. We had raised most of the $1 million that was needed for the 2 statues, one in Calgary in Olympic Plaza and one in Ottawa. But through Isabel and a young architect by the name of Janice Levy became the co-chairs, and they put together a terrific committee. In that I had been in politics and I knew a number of the cabinet ministers and the assistants and whatever. I'd already met with a number of people in Ottawa about how you get a monument on Parliament Hill, and was told it had to fit one of 3 categories. The first category was that it had to be a monarch of Canada who had done substantial good for Canada. The second was that it had to be a father of Confederation. And the third one was that it had to be a deceased prime minister. Well, our women didn't fit quite all those categories. So we said, well, if you have fathers of Confederation, who are the mothers? Well, don't you think these women who brought suffrage, because the West were the first provinces to gain women provincial suffrage, then it went national, then it went through the other provinces, and then opened the doors to the Senate. Don't you think they're mothers? And most of the people said yes. Then we said, monarch of Canada. Well, Irene Parlby's family was good friends with the British royalty. They went on holidays together. They exchanged birthday gifts, but no, she wasn't royalty. So then the last one is deceased prime ministers. And I simply asked the question, which Canadian prime minister has increased democracy in Canada as much as these 5 women? And the answer was silence. Sometimes people said John Diefenbaker, former Prime Minister John Diefenbaker, because he'd brought in a Bill of Rights, but it didn't have enforcement principles and it wasn't as extensive. But it was a start. And then the next major frequent answer was about Pierre Elliott Trudeau and bringing in the charter, for which we are very grateful. And we said yes, but we think what these women did was just codified by him in some regards. But that also reminds me, Deborah, that the famous 5 weren't perfect people. They had some beliefs that we think were unacceptable then, and we certainly know 100 years later.
I was going to raise that with you. Like they were very controversial beliefs.
They had some. That's right. And we have to say, I used to say, well, if they'd known then what we know now, they wouldn't have said that. But we can't quite think that that's really true, but we like to think it is. And also, they did what they thought was the best for women. And it was based on new scientific principles that had worked agriculturally. And so it wasn't against. And some of the information they had was biased information, particularly Emily Murphy. She wrote to all the police chiefs and the judges in North America asking who's peddling drugs. And we now know she got biased information that if little white Johnny was peddling drugs, he was likely bawled out, taken home to his parents, returned to school or whatever. But if Johnny was of any other race, he was considered really suspicious. And so he was taken down to the police hall. The conviction or the sentence, not the sentence, the charge was written up. Yeah. It's all documented. So when you look at the police records, it's all people who, and so you then draw these conclusions, which we now know were not right.
Yeah, but this happens a lot in history. where, if they knew then what we know now, things have advanced so much. So it's not just, eugenics. It's not
Right.
just, some of the other kind of,
Right.
views of the time. It certainly is just a change in times and an evolution in how we have, adapted our views of life and how we're much more inclusive, much more diverse, and how we have to reconcile some of those horrible wrongs in the past and how we have to make them right
Absolutely.
now. So
We have to
so there's this,
reconcile.
we have to reconcile. We have to admit it, reconcile it, move on, and come together. So
Well, we were very lucky in 1997. Jean Chrétien was the prime minister, and he got this idea like this. And we were very lucky in that we had a dinner at the Chateau Laurier in November of 1997, where all the parties sent representatives who were women, thanks to one of the Ottawa Famous Five Foundation volunteers. And the next day was Women's Caucus for the parties. And so they all knew that there was this proposal to put the monument outside the front door of the Senate. And first of all, it's a special bill, and it had to go through the House of Commons. And they presented in such a way that, is there anybody that takes objection to putting this bill? And there were, primarily from the Reform Party. But on the third occasion, Deborah Gray and Preston Manny had come to an agreement that they would support this bill. But nonetheless, there was an objection from Saskatchewan. But Marlene Catterall knew her governance, had the courage to say, please review the tapes, Mr. Speaker, and indeed this bill is still in order. And as a result, it was passed unanimously. And then it went to the Senate, and a senator got up and objected to the putting of the bill, so it died, and we couldn't get a hold of him. The next day, he came back and had second thoughts and said, okay, let the bill go forward. And another senator, this time a female senator, Ann Cools, got up and said, I'm against this bill. It's too much for women and not enough for men, and I want a balance between the two. And she wouldn't talk to us, but somebody did. And this is the magic, I think, of the Famous Five or of women working together. Somebody did say to her, let the bill be discussed. So she comes the next day and she said, I'm prepared to have the bill discussed, but only if you answer some questions from me. And we're sitting in the gallery and thinking, who the heck's going to answer the questions? But sitting as a Conservative senator was the former Dean of Law from Ottawa University, Mr. Baudouin. And so Ann Cools asked the question. Senator Baudouin rises and answers it. Oh, says another senator, I have a question of clarification. And so this went on for about 20 minutes, half an hour, and Baudouin answered all the questions beautifully, technically, with great affection, with great commitment to this. And so the motion passed. And so we're thrilled that wherever the Senate of Canada goes, and if they go back to Parliament Hill, some of us are hoping the Famous Five will go back to Parliament Hill too. But in knowing that most people would not see the Famous Five, either in Calgary and Olympic Plaza or here in Ottawa, we thought, what's another way? And so at that time, the Mint had called for nominations of Canadians for special Millennium coins. So I thought, well, I'll fill out the form. So I did one for each of the five, and then I did one for the group. And I came down to see the Mint because I was coming to do other things about Parliament Hill. And the chap in the Canada Mint office said to me, Frances, there's no chance that you're going to get a quarter for the Famous Five because nobody knows about 5 old, dead women. And so this is one of those occasions where you sort of split in half. You're furious with the person and you're wondering, is he mad because they're 5? Or that they're old? Or that they're women? Or they're dead? On the other half, what a fabulous thing to say. I can go tell it to other people now, and they're going to get it right away. And he says to me, why don't you go see the Mint? Or why don't you go see the Bank of Canada? I said to him, why would I go see the Bank of Canada? Oh, he says, because every 10 to 12 years, the Bank of Canada changes the currency because counterfeiters get smart. And so they have to issue a new series of bills and put in new anti-counterfeit measures. So I make an appointment the next time I'm in Ottawa to go see the Bank of Canada. And by this time, Isabel Metcalf comes with me. And the Bank of Canada has decided to feature large hooven animals on the next series of bills. And it has this big display, like 3 feet by 5 foot, of this wonderful caribou. And Isabel and I and the women of Canada have nothing against large hooven animals. They fed people, they kept them warm, they provided housing for them. But we asked, could this next series of bills coming out in 2002, 2003 feature Canadians and their heroes? And can we please have the $5 bill? And after considerable discussion with the Bank of Canada and the Government of Canada, it was decided we would be on the $50 bill, because on the front of it, it was a 5. We asked for number 5, and that it was William Lyon Mackenzie King who had paid the legal bill for the famous 5 to go to England. But I'm so mad at me, Deborah, that I never thought to ask for the front of the $50 bill. But when the famous 5 were taken off, the shortest time that identifiable Canadian women have been on our currency, a friend in Victoria, a former Parks Canada historian, Myrna Foster, then asked the Bank of Canada to put another woman, and we said, fine, take them off. They've been on long enough, but put more identifiable women on. And so she persuaded them to put Viola Desmond on the front of the $10 bill.
But these are campaigns. These are not, it's just not, this doesn't happen by magic. It's somebody has an idea.
Magic.
But you have an idea and you push it, you bring it forward. And a lot of, I think people have to understand that. It just doesn't, things just don't happen. Somebody has to be asked, somebody has to ask that it happen. I was told that as a young staffer in the Prime Minister's office, let the students march on Parliament Hill because they're asking for something. It's easier to respond to somebody that asks for something. We just don't give things away. Let them ask. I was told that by our principal secretary when young people came to me and said, we're going to have a demonstration. And I was just so worried. Oh my God, I've been in the job for a week and now we're going to get students protesting on Parliament Hill. Oh my God, I'm going to be fired. And he says, no, bring them on. Just, treat them well.
And
let's have a good.
Who is he?
Tom Axworthy.
Working in what Prime Minister's office?
In Trudeau's Prime Minister's. I was doing
Justin Trudeau.
No, Pierre Trudeau.
Pierre Trudeau's.
Pierre Trudeau's office, yeah. And he said, no, he goes, let them come, let them demonstrate. Let's listen to what they have to say. It's really important. So
Right.
It's when people ask, we want somebody on the money or we want somebody on a stamp.
Right.
It's,
Right.
Yeah.
Well, at the same time that we were working on these 2 campaigns for the 70th anniversary in 1999, we did 12 events in Calgary, largely by volunteers. And we did
one in London.
Not yet, excuse me. And yes, you're right, time-wise, sorry. And then you very kindly invited me to come to London because of your phenomenal conference.
Yes, we did the 70th anniversary of the person's case in London at Canada House. I think Canada's been open. I think it reopened in 1998, and we did the conference in 1999. And we actually ran a women's program because of it. We did about 11 different women's events, but that was the first one, and it was to celebrate women in public life, women in the law. And Sheree Blair was our guest speaker. You were one of our guest speakers
at the same event.
Yeah.
So it was 3 days after these 12 events. We flew over, thanks to you.
Yeah.
Was I okay?
You must have been.
Because I was so worn out and whatever. Yes. So, Deborah, thank you very much.
My boss at the time was reluctant to have a letter inviting the Prime Minister's wife to be our guest speaker because she was a very well-known human rights lawyer. And the men in the office said, oh, no, we can't invite her. And I said, yes, you have to invite her. 4 days after receiving the letter, she said yes. And all of a sudden, the men at the High Commission changed their view and just said, oh, can you invite this woman? Can you invite this woman? We'd like this Baroness to be a speaker. And we were going, done. We already invited. We had all this set up. And all of a sudden, they paid attention to the big conference. And so there was women from here, and Beatrice Rafoul came. And there was some really impressive women that came.
Well, you did a good work promoting the person's case, because when Sherry Booth spoke with me after the presentation, she knew all the key questions to ask.
Yeah. And she actually, when she came to Ottawa a couple of years later, she wanted to see the statue.
Yeah.
She came to see the statue.
And it was winter, midwinter, really, really cold.
Yeah.
But the Famous Five Ottawa group greeted her and took her through the monument.
But we did 11 events. We did a whole women's program at the Canadian High Commission.
Well, thank you.
And that was this was just really exciting.
How nice. Yeah. Well, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, while we were touring the miniature of the monument across Canada and at the first Famous Five lunch, people came to me and said, "Why are you singing a sexist anthem, Frances?" And I would say to them, "Oh, I don't know. I'm busy." And because they say you have to do something about it. So I said, "Well, could we just leave it for a little bit, please?" And so once we had finished Calgary and Ottawa, then I turned my attention to, okay, how do we fix the anthem? And it was both men and women who then asked of this. And so I sort of forget some of this stuff. We ended up testifying in front of this. I decided we would start in the Senate. You can start bills in the Senate, but you can't declare war and you can't do budget. You have to respond to a budget. So I thought, because the House of Commons was in a real mess, there was fighting amongst certain Liberal leaders, Martin Graychan. Let's start it in the Senate, because we had senators who were grateful for the person's case. We'd met most of them by that time. And so I asked one of our magnificent donors, because 5 women funded the $1 million for the monuments. And one of them was the glorious Vivian Poy. So I remember going to Vivian Poy in 2001 and saying, "Vivian, thank you very much for," and I didn't know any of these people who gave us money. My group didn't know these people, but they were just names, and we went and talked to them, and then they agreed. "Vivian, would you mind taking on another major project? And this time we would like you to champion the changing of sons into of us. So we will sing True Patriot Love in all of us." So the men, the boys were still there, but it would be all inclusive. Of us. And Vivian took it on, and she was phenomenal. She took it whole nother level. And then, because you have to retire now from the Senate at age 75, when she did, she passed it over to a true icon of Canada, let alone of women's rights, and that's Nancy Ruth from Toronto. Now, I had met Nancy Ruth in 1978, hoping she'd be one of the monument donors, but she had other projects going at the time. But Nancy took it on, and again, then Nancy made buttons, she did songs, she made magnets, but it still didn't go. And so then after Nancy Ruth, it was a very accomplished woman from Toronto by the name of Frances Lankin, who'd been involved with the YWCA, and also Senator Chantal Petitclerc, a Paralympian champion. Now, it was the same thing, even though it had passed the House, and who'd we'd asked also to be the champion in the House. You know, Deborah, I'm mixing this all up. One of the first pieces of people to help us with the anthem was Muriel Bélanger. Yeah. Muriel had gone to law school with my husband. I don't think either of them finished law school, did they?
I don't know.
But I went and spoke to Muriel Bélanger and asked.
Muriel Bélanger was the member of Parliament for Ottawa-Vanier.
That's right.
Yep.
And said to Muriel, "Will you please champion as a private member's bill this anthem?" And he said, "Okay, I will." And so he tried to get it through the House and did not succeed until 2018, when it was passed unanimously. And then it gets to the Senate. And by this time, it's Frances Lankin and Chantal Petitclerc. And again, there had to be approval to present the bill in order to debate the bill. And the Conservatives always blocked it. They said, "We're not prepared to allow it even to be debated." But finally, Frances Lankin and Chantal Petitclerc figured out with the Speaker of the House, James Cowan, what they might do in order to get the bill debated and passed. And finally, on January 31st, 2018, it became the law of Canada. And they immediately, because you have to have the Governor General's signature on it, but the Governor General was over in Korea attending the Olympics. So this was the first bill that was signed electronically by a Governor General.
Interesting. It's interesting. It's also interesting. Vivian Poy and Nancy Ruth have both supported the Women's History Project. So they're still great, great women who make great contributions and really, really help. I wanted to talk a little bit about, and we'll wrap it up in a few minutes, the 95th anniversary.
Thank you.
Yes, I think it's really important. So you've got a lot of campaigns, under your belt now, but the 95th anniversary of the person's case, and I expect you're planning big celebrations.
Well, not as quite as big as we did for the 70th and the 71st here. And I left the Famous Five Foundation in 2005. I think I'd been involved for 10 years and had a spectacular time thinking of ideas and getting ideas carried forward by others. And in the interim, I had also approached the Senate to declare the Famous Five honorary senators. And the lesson there, Deborah, was, which Marjorie Le Breton, who was the leader of the government in the Senate, when I asked her, and she responded after 6 months saying they've read the Hansard, they've read reports, they've looked at past papers of senators. There was nothing in any of that said the Senate could declare anybody an honorary senator. So your little heart sinks. Marjorie then says, but Frances, there's nothing in there that says we can't. So for the 85th anniversary of the person's case, the Senate of Canada declared the Famous Five honorary senators, the first and only to do this. But now we come to the 95th on October 18th of this year. And it's really important for us to celebrate the principle of equality being established across the Commonwealth, affecting the United States, affecting other groups who want equality. It's based on that. And so we have asked our wonderful Governor General to come out to Calgary to present her Persons Awards, which the Right Honourable Joe Clark established in 1979 on the 50th anniversary of the person's case. So she's going to come to Calgary and celebrate them, and we're going to have a number of other events. But we're asking Canadians to please hold pink teas all across Canada. We prepared a kit, information, and we're happy to chat with. We've got a list of groups and individuals to have pink teas on or around October 18th.
I'm coming out to Calgary. Yeah, I'm coming out to Calgary. And the other thing to note, it's not just, you don't have just a group. The Famous Five Foundation is based in Calgary, but you have chapters. So there's activities going on in other places. I know the group in Ottawa is very, very active.
Absolutely.
So it's not just so I expect.
Well, we just have really one other official group, and that's in Sarnia, who came to the foundation about 10 years ago and said, we just really love what you're doing. May we form a chapter? We've had other people inquire in other places, but they sort of couldn't get it all together to do it. But we have contacts, and we now do virtual pink teas because of COVID. So there's several thousand women that tune in and are part of that.
Wonderful speakers.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Canada's full of great women. Canada's full. We just need to know about them.
We
need to support them and tell others and be inspired. Because when you go to either Ottawa or Calgary and see the monument, you will see that there is a chair beside Emily Murphy. And we ask you to sit in the chair and do three things. First of all, thank these women, the Famous Five, and the other women who have built Canada. Secondly, discuss with the Famous Five where you disagree with them and tell them what you think should be done or what they should have said instead. And thirdly, make your pledge to be a nation builder and implement your ideas. So, Deborah, I know you've sat in Emily's chair a number of times and you've done this because you are a nation builder.
Yeah. I mean, I think, because of our friendship and because of the work that you've done, we've created the Women's History Project, which you're very much a part of. And I think the idea is to let others know about these wonderful women in the past who helped, make it a better Canada today.
I'm Deborah Davis, president and co-founder of the Women's History Project. This has been the Women's History Project production. with thanks to our sponsors, partners, and special guests. Please like us, follow us, subscribe, and share. You can find out more about our first season of 1,000 Voices, 1,000 Stories on our website, www.womenshistoryproject.ca.